There was a time when a single point on the world map meant more than gold, power, or wealth. A point of ice and storm, hidden in the most hostile region on Earth. The South Pole was humanity's last great secret at the beginning of the 20th century, and two men were willing to risk everything to reach it. On the one side was Roald Amundsen, strategic, disciplined, calculating. On the other hand, Robert Falcon Scott, ambitious, carried by the pride of the British Empire, convinced of science and the spirit of discovery. Both dreamed of being the first to enter a place that no one had ever seen before. But this race was not a sporting competition with clear rules. It was a fight against hunger, against temperatures of -40 degrees, against months of darkness, and against one's own decisions. The question that hovered over everything was not only, who will be there first, but also, who will return at all? Before we dive into this dramatic story together, I'm interested in your opinion. If you had lived back then, would you have risked everything to make history? Or would your own survival have been more important to you than fame and glory? Write your decision in the comments below. If you are fascinated by such true stories, in which courage and tragedy are inextricably linked, then support this project with a like and accompany us on the next historical adventures. And now the race to the coldest arena on our planet begins. Chapter 1. The Last White Secret: Why Antarctica Became a Myth. It started with a stain. A white, empty space at the bottom of the world map. While continents had been surveyed, coastlines mapped, and even the most remote islands of the Pacific named, the far south remained a promise, or a threat, for a long time. Antarctica was not a country in the classical sense, not a place for settlers, traders, or conquerors. It was an idea, a projection of human longings and fears. And that's exactly why it became a myth. Even in ancient times, scholars suspected that there must be a huge landmass in the south to maintain the balance of the Earth, a terra australis incognita, an unknown southern country. For centuries, this country existed only on maps and in minds. Cartographers drew it as a huge continent, larger than Europe, even though no one had ever seen it. It was not so much a geographical reality as a philosophical necessity. The world had to be symmetrical, so there had to be something down there. It was only in the age of great discoveries that the myth slowly moved into the realm of possibility. When seafarers like James Cook advanced far south in the 18th century, they broke through the Antarctic Circle and sailed around the icy waters. Cook himself never saw the Antarctic mainland, but he recognized the vast ice fields and understood that there was a force of nature here that was not as easy to conquer as tropical coasts or unknown rivers. He wrote that no one would ever go further than him. The cold, the storms, the endless pack ice, all this seemed to be an insurmountable barrier. It was precisely this inaccessibility that made the region fascinating. While Africa, Asia, and America were colonially divided, Antarctica remained untouched. No gold lured here, no spices, no trade routes. There was nothing to win, except fame. And maybe that was exactly the decisive point. In a world where economic interests justified almost every expedition, the journey to the south was an act of pure passion for discovery, or pure hubris. In the 19th century, interest in Antarctica slowly increased. Seal and whalers approached the icy coasts, driven by profit. But even they mostly stayed close to the coast. The interior of the continent remained a mystery. It wasn't just unexplored, it was unimaginable. Nobody knew what was hidden behind the ice barriers. Mountains, forests, an ice-free sea, or nothing but endless, deadly emptiness. The reports of the early expeditions sounded like stories from another world. Men spoke of icebergs the size of cathedrals, of storms that made ships seem like toys, of a silence louder than any sound. The light behaved differently. The sky shimmered in colors that were not known from temperate latitudes. And then there was the polar night, months of complete darkness. Antarctica seemed to defend itself against humans, as if to say, "You don't belong here." At the same time, the world was in a state of upheaval. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of technical euphoria. Steamships replaced sailors, radio technology was created, and new navigation instruments increased precision. Humans had the feeling that they were increasingly able to control nature. Mountains were climbed, deserts crossed, rivers conquered. It was only a matter of time before the extreme south also came into focus. This is how the so-called heroic age of polar exploration began. Nations saw expeditions not only as scientific undertakings, but also as prestige projects. A flag in the ice meant international recognition. Whoever reached the South Pole would not only mark a geographical coordinate, he would make history. But why the South Pole in particular? Why did this invisible point exert such an attraction? Maybe because he was absolute. The South Pole is not a mountain that can be seen from afar. No river to follow. It is a mathematical place, defined by the axis of the Earth. Invisible, abstract, and that's precisely why it's so symbolic. Whoever reached him had literally entered the end of the world. From there, every step led only to the north. This symbolism acted like a magnet. At a time when empires were struggling for influence, the South Pole became the ultimate target. It was neutral ground, and yet a scene of national honor. Norway, Great Britain, Germany, France, they all watched closely to see who would dare to make the next advance. But in addition to political ambition, science also played a central role. Meteorology, geology, magnetism, Antarctica offered unique conditions for research. Its isolated location made it a natural laboratory. Scientists hoped to gain insights into the Earth's climate, ocean currents, and even the formation of the planet. The myth was therefore fed not only by a thirst for adventure, but also by a thirst for knowledge. Nevertheless, the image of Antarctica remained ambivalent. It was a projection screen for heroism, and at the same time for failure. Everyone knew that anyone who went there was gambling with their lives. The logistical challenges were enormous. Food had to be carried for months. Animals, dogs or ponies, were used as a means of transport. A single mistake could be fatal. And this is exactly where the real fascination began. Antarctica was not an adversary that could be defeated with weapons or diplomacy. She was indifferent. It did not react to courage or national pride. It did not reward bravery or punish arrogance. It simply existed. This indifference made her so threatening and so pure. In newspapers of those years, the South was often referred to as the last great challenge. Readers devoured reports about expeditions, cheered along, discussed strategies. Men who set out for the ice became national heroes even before they had set foot on the ice sheet. The idea that somewhere at the bottom of the Earth there was a goal waiting that no man had yet reached electrified the public. At the same time, Antarctica was a stage for extremes. Temperatures far below freezing. Winds that swept over the plateau with unimaginable speed. Altitudes of over 3,000 meters, hidden under ice. The continent was higher, drier, and colder than any other region on Earth. It combined superlatives, and yet eluded any romantic transfiguration as soon as you actually entered it. The myth was thus fed by a field of tension, between ignorance and scientific ambition, between national prestige and personal borderline experience, between heroic history and existential threat. Antarctica was the last white secret because it was not only geographically unexplored, but also psychologically. She asked the question, how far is a person willing to go just to be able to say, I was there? When the 20th century dawned, the stage was set. Technology had improved, the maps had become more precise, ships more stable. But the core of the myth remained untouched. Anyone who set off for the south entered a space that eluded any civilization. No tree, no animal, no sound of human life. Only ice. Heavens. Wind. And somewhere there, invisible and yet omnipresent, the South Pole was waiting. Antarctica has never been just a continent. It was a touchstone. For courage. For planning. For leadership. It forced people to meet themselves, without distractions, without comfort. In the endless expanse of ice, vanities shrank. All that remained was the question of survival. Perhaps this is the real reason why it became a myth. Not because of their size. Not because of their coldness. But because it erases everything superfluous. Those who survive there exist by their own strength. And if you fail, you can't blame anyone but yourself, or the merciless weather. Thus, the white spot on the map became a symbol. For the unknown. For the last step into the extreme. For the human longing to push boundaries, even if the price is immeasurable. Before the real race began, before names like Amundsen and Scott were indelibly linked to the South Pole, this myth already existed. A myth of ice and silence. Out of ambition and fear. A myth that led men to leave their homeland and embark on a journey they didn't know if they would ever return. Antarctica did not wait. She did not call. She promised nothing. And that's exactly what made her irresistible. Chapter 2. Early explorers and failed ventures. The path to the unknown. Before the race to the South Pole became a dramatic duel between two men, it was a slow, arduous groping into a world that no one understood. Antarctica was not discovered with a single bold step. It was felt, in stages, with detours, errors, and setbacks. Each advance brought new insights to light, but also new limits. And often failure was more instructive than any success. When James Cook sailed his ships far south in the 1770s, he did so at a time when large parts of the world had already been mapped. Cook was one of the first to cross the Antarctic Circle and proved that if there was a huge Southland, it was not in the temperate latitudes, as many geographers had long believed. Instead, he found an endless field of drift ice and icebergs. He sailed around the continent without ever seeing it directly. His conclusion was sober. If there was land down there, it was surrounded by such cold that it could hardly be of any use. This assessment initially curbed interest. There were no obvious riches, no indigenous population, no strategic advantage. And yet the fascination did not disappear. In the early 19th century, whalers and seal hunters advanced further and further south, driven by economic profit. Their ships were robust, but not designed for months of ice trips. They moved on the edge of the familiar, always in danger of being trapped and crushed by the pack ice. Around 1820, there was increasing evidence that a continent actually existed. Several expeditions sighted coastlines or ice shelves almost simultaneously. The Russian Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, the Briton Edward Bransfield, and the American Nathaniel Palmer are still associated with the first confirmed sighting of the Antarctic mainland. But sighting did not mean understanding. You could see outlines, guess land behind the ice, but no one knew how big this continent was or what was hidden inside. The early expeditions were mainly sea voyages. The real heart of Antarctica, the huge ice sheet, remained inaccessible. The coasts were protected by huge ice shelf barriers that rose out of the sea like frozen cliffs. Ships could not simply land and start an expedition inland. The ice itself was alive. It broke, drifted, closed again. Those who hesitated too long risked being trapped with their ship. In the middle of the 19th century, scientific interests began to come to the fore. Nations don't just want to discover, they want to measure, map, and analyze. Magnetic measurements were particularly important because navigation at sea depended heavily on understanding the Earth's magnetic field. One of the most important names of this time was James Clark Ross. Between 1839 and 1843, he led an ambitious expedition to the South Pacific and finally to Antarctic waters. In the process, he discovered the Ross Sea, named after him, as well as the massive Ross Ice Shelf, an ice barrier of almost unimaginable size. Ross came closer to the geographic South Pole than anyone before him. But even he remained hundreds of kilometers away. His ships were not built to operate permanently in the ice. And there was still a lack of knowledge about how to get around inland. Dogs were used in the Arctic, but their use in the Antarctic had not yet been systematically tested. Skiing techniques, which were commonplace in Scandinavia, were largely foreign to British sailors. After Ross, interest ebbed away again. For decades, it remained relatively quiet around Antarctica. Other regions of the world became the focus of imperial ambitions. Africa was divided, Asia was colonially influenced, industrial revolutions changed societies. The far south seemed to become a marginal issue again. But in the late 19th century, the spirit of discovery returned, now under new auspices. Scientific societies pushed for systematic research. Meteorology, oceanography, and geophysics developed rapidly. Antarctica appeared to be a key region for understanding global contexts. At the same time, national competition grew. Expeditions became symbols of technological prowess. One of the first expeditions of the so-called heroic age was the Belgian Antarctic expedition led by Adrien de Gerlache, 1897 to 1899. Their ship, the Belgica, was trapped in the pack ice. The crew involuntarily hibernated in complete darkness. It was the first time humans had fully experienced an Antarctic winter. The psychological and physical stress was enormous. Scurvy spread, depression increased. Only through improvised measures and the consumption of fresh penguin and seal meat did the crew survive. This expedition was not a triumph in the classical sense, but it proved that wintering was possible. Shortly afterwards, the British Discovery Expedition under the leadership of Robert Falcon Scott started in 1901. It was Scott's first trip to Antarctica, long before he would become the tragic protagonist of the race. Together with Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson, he advanced further south than anyone before. They reached 82 degrees 17 minutes south latitude, a new record. But the price was high. Scurvy weakened the men. Extreme cold and exhaustion forced them to turn back. These expeditions made one thing clear: the way to the South Pole was not an easy march over flat ice. It was a logistical puzzle. Food had to be deposited in advance. Means of transport had to function reliably. The choice between dogs, ponies, or human traction was not trivial. Any mistake in planning could be fatal months later. Ernest Shackleton also made a bold attempt to reach the South Pole in 1907 to 1909. With the Nimrod expedition, he came within about 180 kilometers of the goal. He was faced with a decision: move on and possibly be the first to enter the pole, or turn back to save his men. Shackleton decided to turn back. Later he said that it was better to be a living donkey than a dead lion. This decision saved the lives of his team, but cost him the possible glory. All these advances had one thing in common: they pushed the boundaries of what was possible without reaching the goal. Every failed attempt was also a step forward. New maps were created. Mountains were identified. Routes across the Ross ice shelf were explored. They learned how extreme cold affects equipment, how important sufficient nutrition is, how treacherously snowdrifts can hide depots. The path into the unknown was therefore not a single heroic act. It was a collective learning process, fed by courage, error, and perseverance. Antarctica forced its visitors to learn humility. Technology alone was not enough. Discipline alone was not enough. It took experience, and even then there was a remnant of unpredictability. As the first decade of the 20th century drew to a close, the South Pole was no longer an unattainable myth. It had become tangible. The distance was known. The route across the Ross Sea seemed promising. The Transantarctic Mountains were mapped. It was known that the ice sheet was a high plateau, cold, windswept, but in principle walkable. And this was exactly where the decisive change lay. A vague idea had become a concrete goal. The myth had not disappeared, but it had taken shape. It was now known that the South Pole was accessible. The question was no longer if, but who. The early explorers had paved the way. They had suffered, frozen, starved. They had improvised, made mistakes, turned around. Some returned broken, others celebrated as heroes. But they all contributed to making the unknown a bit smaller. Without them, there would have been no race. Not a dramatic duel. No flags in the ice. The path to the unknown was paved with failed advances, and it was precisely these that made the later race possible in the first place. Chapter 3. The beginning of the Polar Age, Technology, Ambition, and National Pride. When the 20th century dawned, the world was on the move. Steam power had made oceans more predictable, steel replaced wood, telegraphs connected continents in seconds. Cities grew, empires expanded, science became the driving force of modern societies. In this atmosphere of belief in progress and competition, a new form of adventure emerged, the systematic conquest of the last white spots on Earth. The so-called heroic age of polar exploration was no coincidence. It was the result of an era that was convinced that there was no border that could not be moved. The Arctic had already produced its heroes and tragedies. Names like Fridtjof Nansen stood for courage and innovation. Nansen's drift with the Fram in the Arctic ice proved that it was not only possible to fight against nature, but to use its forces strategically. His approach was scientifically well thought out, technically prepared, and at the same time daring. It was precisely this mixture that became the model for a new generation of polar explorers. The South now finally became the center of attention. Technology played a decisive role in this. Expeditions were no longer improvised adventures, but complex logistical undertakings. Specially reinforced ships with massive hulls were to withstand the pressure of the pack ice. Navigation instruments became more precise, meteorological measuring instruments more reliable. They began to systematically create depots, plan routes in advance, and test equipment under realistic conditions. The ice was no longer a mere obstacle, it became a calculable risk. But technology alone did not explain the growing zeal. Behind the expeditions was a powerful engine, national ambition. Europe was in a phase of intense competition. Britain was the dominant empire, but Germany, France, Russia, and even smaller nations like Norway were looking for ways to demonstrate their influence. The South Pole offered a unique stage. It was politically neutral, economically untapped, and therefore ideal for achieving symbolic victories. For Great Britain, polar exploration was closely linked to imperial identity. The empire saw itself as a maritime power, as a nation of seafarers and explorers. A successful expedition to Antarctica was not only a scientific triumph, but a confirmation of national greatness. The Royal Geographical Society supported projects not only for research interests, but also for reasons of prestige. Every advance to the south was accompanied in newspapers. Every mile towards the pole was celebrated as the progress of the nation. At the same time, a new self-confidence grew in Norway. The country had broken away from Sweden in 1905 and was looking for international recognition. Polar research was part of the national identity, shaped by generations of sailors, fishermen, and skiers. While Great Britain relied on military tradition and imperial structures, Norway relied on practical experience in dealing with cold and snow. Two different cultures, two different approaches, and a common goal. Science also gained in importance. Expeditions were increasingly organized on an interdisciplinary basis. Geologists examined rock samples, biologists cataloged animal species, meteorologists recorded weather data. Antarctica was considered a key region for understanding global climate systems. It was hoped to gain insights into ocean currents, magnetic fields, and atmospheric circulation. Research and fame were closely intertwined. Anyone who reached the pole not only brought a flag with them, but also data, and thus knowledge. But behind all this there was also a cultural ideal, the image of the heroic explorer. In a time of growing industrialization and urbanization, many people longed for stories of courage and deprivation. The polar explorers embodied virtues that were considered threatened: discipline, willingness to make sacrifices, camaraderie. Their expeditions became moral lessons. Newspapers stylized them as modern knights who fought not dragons, but ice storms. Technical innovations have also changed the way people move around in the ice. Sled dogs were used more systematically, especially by Scandinavian expeditions. Skis enabled more efficient movements over long distances. At the same time, experiments were being carried out with motorized sleds, early attempts to bring machine power to Antarctica. Not all experiments were successful. Engines failed in extreme cold, lubricants froze, metal became brittle. But the will to break new ground was unbroken. The preparation of an expedition became a national affair. Fundraising campaigns were organized, equipment was presented to the public, teams were carefully selected. Each participant had to be not only physically robust, but also mentally stable. Months of isolation, darkness, and monotonous nutrition were enormous burdens. The selection procedures became stricter, training more intensive. It was now known that not only the ice was dangerous, but also the dynamics within a small trapped group. With the growing professionalism, the risk also increased. Because the closer you got to the goal, the greater the pressure became. Records became benchmarks. Those who advanced further south than their predecessors were celebrated. Those who failed had to justify themselves. The South Pole was no longer an abstract ideal, but a concrete point of competition. And competitions create expectations. At the same time, the international rivalry intensified. Expeditions were increasingly prepared in secret to secure strategic advantages. Routes were not published in full. Plans were only discussed in a close circle. The idea that several nations could set off for the pole at the same time was no longer a fantasy, but a real possibility. The polar age gradually turned into a race. At the same time, Antarctica itself remained indifferent. Technical progress reduced risks, but did not eliminate them. Temperatures of -50 degrees caused metal to crack and skin to freeze in seconds. Storms could last for days and bury tents under masses of snow. Orientation was difficult even with precise instruments, as the White Plateau offered hardly any visual clues. Humans brought technology with them, but nature continued to determine the rules. The beginning of the Polar Age was therefore marked by a field of tension between modern self-confidence and archaic powerlessness. There were better ships, better clothing, better planning, and yet every expedition remained a step into the unknown. It was precisely this mixture that made it so appealing. Progress promised security, but the residual risk gave the company importance. For the public, technology, ambition, and national pride merged into one big narrative. Expeditions were interpreted as proof of the superiority of a system. Was it Britain's military discipline? The pragmatic efficiency of Norway? Germany's scientific thoroughness? Each nation sought its confirmation in the ice. And so Antarctica became a mirror of political and cultural identities. The South Pole was not only a geographical destination, but a symbol of the self-image of entire countries. Whoever achieved it would gain more than a coordinate, it would shape history. As the decade before 1910 drew to a close, it was clear that the decisive advance was imminent. The technical prerequisites were created, the routes tested, the distances calculated. Several experienced polar explorers had proven that it was possible to get within a few hundred kilometers of the pole. Now only the last step was missing. So the Polar Age was not a spontaneous adventure, but the result of years of preparation, scientific curiosity, and national ambition. Technology had paved the way, ambition had accelerated it, and national pride had given it drama. The stage was set, the world looked south. In the ice there was no applause, no audience. But beyond the white expanse, newspapers, governments, and millions of readers were waiting. The South Pole had become the ultimate touchstone, for machines, for strategies, for people. And soon it would become clear whose combination of technique, planning, and determination was strong enough to finally break through the last white secret. Chapter 4. Roald Amundsen, the calculating strategist. When the race to the South Pole came to a head, one of the two main players had long since become an experienced man of the ice. Roald Amundsen was not a romantic adventurer who was driven by fame alone. He was a planner, an observer, a man who learned from the mistakes of others, and even more from his own. Born in Norway in 1872, Amundsen grew up in a nation shaped by the sea. Even as a teenager, he devoured reports of expeditions to the Arctic. He was particularly impressed by the stories of Fridtjof Nansen. Nansen's systematic approach, his ability to combine scientific knowledge with practical experience, became a model for Amundsen. But while Nansen often thought visionarily, Amundsen was uncompromisingly pragmatic. His first major test was the crossing of the Northwest Passage between 1903 and 1906. With a small ship, the GJOA, he mastered a route on which generations of seafarers had failed. Unlike many British expeditions, he relied on small, flexible teams instead of large, cumbersome undertakings. He hibernated several times, studied the behavior of the ice, and learned from the Inuit how to survive in extreme cold. Clothing made of animal skins, loose layers instead of tight uniforms, the targeted use of sled dogs, all these were lessons he did not forget. These experiences shaped his philosophy: nature cannot be defeated, but you can adapt to it. Anyone who tries to transfer European habits to the ice will fail. Those who are willing to learn from indigenous techniques drastically increase their chances. For Amundsen, this was not a question of pride, but of efficiency. Originally, he planned to reach the North Pole. But when news came in 1909 that both Frederick Cook and Robert Peary claimed to have reached the North Pole, the situation changed abruptly. Even if these claims later remained controversial, it was clear to Amundsen that the glory of the North Pole was forgiven, or at least damaged. The South Pole, on the other hand, was still waiting. In a decision that reveals his character, Amundsen initially kept his change of course secret. Even part of his crew only learned on the way south that the actual destination was not the Arctic, but Antarctica. To outsiders, this may have seemed like deception. For Amundsen, it was a strategic necessity. He knew that an open race with British competitors could create political and financial obstacles. Discretion bought him time, and a head start. His expedition ship was the Fram, the legendary ship that Nansen had already carried through the Arctic ice. The Fram was specially designed to withstand the pressure of the pack ice. Her torso was round, so she was lifted by the ice instead of crushed. Amundsen knew that reliable technology was the basis of any strategy. He did not rely on experiments, but on the tried and tested. Even more decisive, however, was his choice of base camp. While British expeditions often operated from the Ross Sea, Amundsen opted for the Bay of Whales at the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf. This location was closer to the South Pole than previous bases and thus offered a strategic advantage. The risk was that the ice shelf could be unstable, but Amundsen calculated that the time gained outweighed the danger. His planning was meticulous. Depots were set up at exact intervals, generously marked with high snow poles and flags that were visible from afar. He knew that the biggest risk was on the way back. Anyone who returned to the north exhausted and malnourished could not run the risk of missing a depot. Therefore, he marked the surroundings of the depots in wide corridors, a seemingly small measure, but one that could make the difference between life and death. Amundsen relied uncompromisingly on sled dogs. For him, they were not only a means of transport, but a strategic resource. From the beginning, he planned to slaughter some of the dogs on the way in order to provide both humans and remaining animals with fresh meat. This sober calculation may seem harsh, but it significantly reduced the risk of scurvy and food shortages. Emotional attachment was not allowed to undermine the planning. His team's clothing also differed significantly from British standards. Instead of heavy wool uniforms, the Norwegians wore fur clothing based on the Arctic model. They moved around on skis, a technique that was natural for them. Efficiency took precedence over tradition. Speed was a decisive factor. Amundsen himself was not a loud leader. He led through competence and clarity. He made decisions objectively. Discussions were sober. His men knew that every detail was part of a larger plan. Discipline did not mean rigidity, but precision. When the Fram reached the Bay of Whales in January 1911, the construction of the base camp Framheim began. Everything was systematically prepared, Workshops were set up, supplies sorted, sleds tested. The Antarctic winter was used to optimize processes. Amundsen had his team train, create depots in advance, and practice every move. The actual march to the pole should not be an improvised adventure, but the implementation of a previously precisely thought-out plan. Amundsen was by no means free of risk. His chosen route inland led over the unknown Axel Heiberg Glacier area, a route that no one had ever taken before. But it was precisely here that his strategic thinking became apparent. Instead of using well-known but longer routes, he looked for the shortest connection. Time was energy, energy was survival. His leadership style was characterized by adaptability. When an early launch attempt failed in September 1911 due to extreme cold, he did not hesitate to turn back. Some members suffered from frostbite. For Amundsen, it was clear, a false ambition could endanger the entire expedition. He waited patiently for better conditions instead of being driven by competitive pressure. This ability to separate emotions from decisions set him apart from many of his contemporaries. For Amundsen, the South Pole was not a romantic ideal. It was a logistical target. Each stage was a calculation task: distance, temperature, calorie consumption, number of dogs. Success was the result of correct calculation. At the same time, he was aware of the symbolic significance of his project. As a representative of the young, independent Norway, he knew that success would radiate far beyond the expedition. But this thought remained in the background. The focus was always on the question, is the plan working? On October 19, 1911, the five-man pole team finally set off. 4 men accompanied Amundsen, supported by 52 dogs. The depots were prepared, the route marked, the equipment tested. Nothing was left to chance. The endless white expanse showed whether strategy was stronger than myth. Amundsen did not move against Antarctica, but with it. He accepted their rules, took advantage of their circumstances, and avoided unnecessary risks. Each step was part of a larger calculation. Roald Amundsen was not a hero in the classical sense. He was not looking for drama, not for heroic gestures. His strength lay in preparation, in sober analysis, in the courage to adapt. While other expeditions failed due to improvisation or exaggerated ambition, he relied on clarity. The calculating strategist had a goal in mind, and a plan to achieve it. In a race that would soon make history, his greatest weapon was not courage alone, but precision. Chapter 5. Robert Falcon Scott, Der Idealist de Empire. If Roald Amundsen was the cool calculator, then Robert Falcon Scott was the man of conviction. He was not an adventurer out of pure curiosity, and not a tactician who subordinated everything to a sober calculation. Scott was an officer in the Royal Navy, characterized by a sense of duty, hierarchy, and a deeply rooted belief in the moral greatness of the British Empire. For him, the trip to Antarctica was not just an expedition, it was a mission. Born in 1868 into a middle-class family with a maritime tradition, Scott joined the Navy at an early age. Discipline, honor, and loyalty were not buzzwords, but cornerstones of his life. He was ambitious, but not ruthless, proud, but not arrogant. At a time when the British Empire dominated the globe, Scott embodied that ideal of the dutiful officer in the service of a greater cause. His first encounter with Antarctica took place as part of the Discovery Expedition, 1901 to 1904, an undertaking that was driven by scientific ambition as well as national prestige. Together with Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson, Scott penetrated further south than any man before. They reached 82 degrees 17 minutes south latitude, a new record. But the success came at a high price. Scurvy weakened the men, and the return became a struggle for survival. This first expedition had a lasting impact on Scott. He had seen how ruthless Antarctica could be. At the same time, he had learned how much the British public thirsted for heroic stories. After his return, he was celebrated. Lectures, honors, newspaper reports. Scott had become the face of British polar research. But the thought matured in him that the work was unfinished. the South Pole remained unreached. In contrast to Amundsen, Scott's motivation was complex. Science played a central role for him. The planned Terra Nova expedition, 1910 to 1913, was not only intended to reach the South Pole, but also to carry out extensive research programs. Geology, meteorology, biology. Scott wanted to collect data that would last beyond the symbolic triumph. For him, the pole was not an isolated goal, but part of a larger project. The organization of the expedition reflected this claim. The ship Terra Nova was solid, but not a marvel specially designed for ice like the Fram. The team was bigger, more heterogeneous. Scientists, officers, sailors, a mixture of military structure and academic curiosity. Scott relied on hierarchy and clear lines of command. He made decisions as commander, but he also sought the advice of his officers. A key difference to Amundsen was the choice of means of transport. Scott experimented with snowmobiles, Siberian ponies, and sled dogs. The snowmobiles were considered a symbol of modern technology, an expression of the belief in progress at the time. But the extreme cold took its toll on the machines. Lubricants frozen, components failed. The ponies proved to be vulnerable in the deep snow and suffered from the conditions. Dogs were efficient, but in the British context there was often a lack of routine in dealing with them. Scott was aware of the Arctic experience of Scandinavian expeditions, but he also relied on British traditions. Human traction, so-called man-hauling, was understood as an expression of perseverance and strength of character. Men who pulled their own sleds were considered the epitome of heroic determination. This attitude reflected a cultural ideal, perseverance as a moral virtue. When the Terra Nova set off south in 1910, the mood was one of expectation. Scott knew he wasn't alone. Rumors of Amundsen's change of course had reached him. A scientific mission increasingly turned into a race. But Scott did not react with haste. He stuck to his comprehensive expedition plan. The base camp at Cape Evans on the Ross Sea has been carefully furnished. During the Antarctic winter, the teams prepared for the march. Depots were created, equipment tested, scientific work carried out. Scott planned in stages, with support teams to accompany the pole team on the way there and then turn back. This system was intended to save resources, but required precise coordination. Scott himself was not an unapproachable commander. His diaries reveal a sensitive, reflective man. He worried about his team, doubted decisions, weighed risks. At the same time, he felt the burden of responsibility towards his men, his nation, his family. For him, the South Pole was not only a geographical mark, but a touchstone of his life's work. In October 1911, the long march across the Ross ice shelf began. The snowmobiles dropped out early. The ponies had to be shot one by one when they could no longer withstand the conditions. Dogs supported part of the way, but in the end it was mainly human traction that remained. Heavy sleds, icy wind, temperatures far below freezing, every step cost strength. The route led over the Beardmore Glacier area up to the Antarctic Plateau. The altitude, over 3,000 meters, made breathing difficult, the cold more intense. Scott made a momentous decision. Instead of the originally planned 4 men, he included 5 in the final pole team, including Henry Robertson Bowers. This decision reduced rations per capita and changed the calculation of supplies. It was an act of camaraderie, but also a logistical risk. On January 17, 1912, Scott and his 4 companions finally reached the South Pole. A Norwegian flag awaited them there. Amundsen had beaten them to it 5 weeks earlier. In Scott's diary there is the sober, painful entry that everything is over. No triumph, no jubilation. Only disappointment and the realization that the way back was still to come. It was at this moment that Scott's character showed itself. Instead of falling into resignation, he precisely documented their situation, photographed the find, and began the march back. However, conditions deteriorated drastically. Cold, exhaustion, and lack of food took their toll on the group. Edgar Evans was the first to die, weakened by injuries and exhaustion. Later, Lawrence Oates voluntarily left the tent, saying that he was only going out for a moment, a quiet act of self-sacrifice to increase the chances of survival of others. But fate could not turn this victim around either. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers remained trapped in a tent just a few miles from a supply depot. A storm prevented the last march. When their bodies were found months later, Scott's diaries were neatly stowed away next to him. His last entries testify to concern for the bereaved and to a deep awareness of the significance of the events. "For God's sake, take care of our loved ones," he wrote. It was not a call for glory, but an expression of human solidarity. In Great Britain, Scott became a martyr. His story fit into the ideal of the self-sacrificing hero who gave his life in the service of the nation. Poems were written, monuments were erected, school textbooks told of courage and dignity in the face of death. The defeat in the race was outshone by moral greatness. Today, Scott is viewed in a more differentiated way. Historians discuss his decisions, compare strategies, analyze planning errors. But beyond all criticism, one thing remains indisputable: he acted out of conviction. For him, the expedition was more than a competition. It was an expression of a worldview in which duty, science, and national honor were inextricably linked. Robert Falcon Scott was the idealist of the empire. His belief in discipline, camaraderie, and moral fortitude shaped every stage of his journey. In the race against a calculating strategist, he stood for a different kind of greatness, one that is measured not only in victory, but in behavior in the face of failure. In the endless white of Antarctica, he did not leave behind a victorious flag, but a story of courage, tragedy, and humanity. And perhaps it is precisely this story that resonates to this day. Chapter 6. Two Nations, One Goal, Norway vs. Great Britain. When the ships of the two expeditions made their way south, they carried more with them than provisions, sleds, and scientific instruments. They carried the expectations of entire nations. The race to the South Pole has long been more than a personal duel between Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott. It had become a symbolic trial of strength between Norway and Great Britain, between a young, aspiring state and a world empire at the height of its power. At the beginning of the 20th century, Great Britain saw itself as a maritime superpower. The empire spanned the globe, the Royal Navy dominated the oceans. British officers and explorers were considered the epitome of discipline and leadership. Expeditions were part of this identity. They not only served scientific purposes, but also confirmed the self-image of a nation that believed that it was inherently destined to open up unknown spaces. Norway, on the other hand, was only completely independent from Sweden since 1905. The young nation was looking for ways to distinguish itself internationally. Their strength lay not in colonial expansion, but in maritime experience, in fishing, trade, and polar travel. Names such as Fridtjof Nansen had already proven that Norwegians had exceptional competence in dealing with ice and snow. For Norway, the South Pole was an opportunity to assert itself on the world stage, not through size, but through skill. These different starting positions shaped the entire dynamic of the race. Great Britain competed with institutional support, and Scott's expedition was supported by geographical societies, private sponsors, and the public. Newspapers regularly reported on progress, and fundraising campaigns mobilized patriotic feelings. The South Pole was a national project. Amundsen's project, on the other hand, was initially characterized by greater restraint. He kept his decision to head for the South Pole instead of the North Pole a secret for a long time. When it became known that he was actually sailing towards Antarctica, it surprised not only the international public, but also Scott himself. From the British point of view, it seemed like a silent attack on an already claimed target. It had been assumed that the South Pole was to a certain extent British territory, not officially, but morally. But the ice knew no moral claims. It was neutral. And it was precisely this neutrality that made the race so explosive. Two expeditions, two bases, two strategies, separated by hundreds of kilometers, connected by a single goal. The differences started with the planning. Amundsen relied on a small homogeneous team of experienced skiers and dog sledders. Efficiency was the top priority. Speed meant safety. Each man was selected according to practical competence in the ice. Scientific programs played a subordinate role. The main goal was clearly defined: to reach the pole and return safely. Scott, on the other hand, led a larger, more complex expedition. In addition to the pole advance, extensive scientific work was to be carried out. Geologists collected rock samples. Biologists examined wildlife and vegetation. Meteorologists documented weather data. The pole was the climax, but not the sole purpose. This multiple burden required more personnel, more equipment, more logistics, and thus increased complexity. The two nations also differed culturally in their approach. Norwegians were familiar with skis from an early age. Snowy landscapes were part of her everyday life. Dealing with sled dogs was a matter of course. In Great Britain, on the other hand, skiing was exotic, dog sledding practice limited. The British tradition of man-hauling, i.e. the pulling of heavy sleds by human power, reflected an ideal of physical toughness and moral steadfastness. For Norwegians, this method was inefficient. For the British, it was an expression of character. The choice of base camps intensified the competition. Amundsen built Framheim in the Bay of Wales, closer to the South Pole than previous British camps. Scott stayed at Cape Evans on the Ross Sea, a proven but more distant position. The distances were precisely calculable. Every kilometer counted. From the beginning, Amundsen had a geographical advantage. But it was not only a race on the ice, but also a psychological duel. Both leaders knew about each other. Both knew the experiences of past expeditions. Each had to make decisions without knowing exactly how far the other had already progressed. In the isolation of Antarctica, uncertainty became a constant companion. For the public in Europe, the race took on a dramatic dimension, with newspapers speculating about progress, drawing maps, calculating distances. The South Pole became a projection screen for national hopes. In Great Britain, they were convinced that discipline and scientific thoroughness would be the deciding factor. In Norway, they relied on experience in the snow and strategic clarity. The balance of power was unequal on paper. Britain had greater resources, more financial support, broader institutional structures. Norway was smaller, more financially limited. But it is precisely these differences that have led to different priorities. While Scott balanced several goals, Amundsen focused uncompromisingly on one. The actual march to the pole began in October 1911. Both expeditions set off almost at the same time, not knowing how close or far the other was. Antarctica itself became the arbiter. Weather conditions, snow conditions, temperatures, all of this influenced speed and energy reserves. With every day that the men moved further south, the symbolic meaning of their steps grew. Every ski set, every sled pulled was part of an invisible race. And yet both teams moved in complete silence, separated by hundreds of kilometers of ice. When Amundsen reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911, he hoisted the Norwegian flag and named the plateau Polheim. It was a moment of historic significance. A small, young country had achieved the greatest geographical goal of its time. Efficiency had triumphed over size. 5 weeks later, Scott reached the same point and found the Norwegian flag. At that moment, the national competition became a personal tragedy. The defeat was not only sporting, but symbolic. Britain, the empire, was too late. But the story did not end with the hoisting of a flag. Amundsen returned successfully, his team relatively safe. Scott and his companions died on the way back. In Britain, defeat turned into a tale of sacrifice and moral greatness. Scott became a martyr of the empire, Amundsen to the sober winner. Thus, two national self-images collided. Norway celebrated strategic precision and practical competence. Britain honored perseverance, sacrifice, and dignity in failure. The race to the South Pole was thus more than a geographical event, it became a mirror of cultural values. In retrospect, it is clear that both nations were successful in their own way. Norway won the race and international recognition. Great Britain won a legend that shaped generations. The ice had decided, but the interpretation was left to the people. Two nations, one goal. Separated by ideals, united in the courage to enter the unknown. The South Pole had been reached, but the myth of the race lived on, carried by stories of ice, ambition, and national pride. Chapter 7. Preparations for life and death, dogs, ponies, and provisions. Before even one step towards the South Pole was taken, the race was decided in workshops, warehouses, and on training fields. Antarctica did not forgive improvisation. Anyone who wanted to survive there had to plan months, even years, in advance. Every seam in the clothes, every screw in the sleigh, every calorie in the provisions could later make the difference between life and death. The march to the pole began long before the first tracks were pressed into the ice. For Roald Amundsen, preparation was synonymous with minimizing risk. His experience in the Arctic had shown him that efficiency had to take precedence over moral judgments. Dogs were the heart of the strategy for him. Greenlandic sled dogs, robust, enduring, adapted to extreme cold. They could pull heavy loads, found their way through snowdrifts on their own, and served as a food reserve if necessary. This sober calculation was not a sign of cruelty, but an expression of a clear priority, the survival of the team. Amundsen procured more dogs than he would need for the entire trail. From the beginning, he planned to reduce the number on the road. Weaker animals were to be slaughtered in order to provide stronger dogs and men with fresh meat. In doing so, he solved several problems at once: weight loss, food supply, and vitamin deficiency. Scurvy, the scourge of previous expeditions, should be avoided by eating fresh meat. It was a strategy based on Arctic experience, and on a willingness to put emotional attachments behind rational decisions. His consistency was also evident in the equipment. Slides have been tested several times, unnecessary weight has been removed, and every construction has been tested for stability. Clothing consisted of furs, loosely cut, breathable and insulating at the same time. Skis were a matter of course, not as sports equipment, but as tools. For Amundsen, it was unthinkable to trudge hundreds of kilometers on foot through deep snow if gliding movements could save energy. The preparations for Robert Falcon Scott were completely different. His Terra Nova expedition was bigger, more complex, more scientifically ambitious. The choice of means of transport became a debate. A combination of snowmobiles, Siberian ponies, dogs, and human traction was chosen. This mixture reflected both belief in progress and tradition. The snowmobiles were considered a symbol of modern technology. If machines could take over heavy loads, men would be spared and speed would be gained. But the reality of Antarctica made high demands: extreme cold, uneven snow surfaces, mechanical susceptibility. Despite intensive preparation, a residual risk remained. Lubricants could freeze, engines could fail, spare parts were missing. The ponies, on the other hand, appeared to be a pragmatic solution. They were strong, could pull large loads, and were considered reliable workhorses. But they came from temperate climate zones. Deep snow, icy temperatures, and sparse food sources took their toll on them. While dogs intuitively mastered snow, ponies sank in, struggled, and needed additional food, a logistical disadvantage. The decision to combine several transport methods should bring flexibility. In fact, however, it increased complexity. Different animals mean different needs, different speeds, different risks. Each additional factor increased the uncertainty. A central element of both expeditions was the creation of depots. Provisions, fuel, and spare material were buried at regular intervals along the planned route. These depots were lifelines. If you missed one in a snowstorm, it could have fatal consequences. Amundsen generously marked his depots with wide flag lines to maximize findability. Scott also set markers, but less wide. In the endless white landscape, a small navigational error could be fatal. The question of provisions was of existential importance. Calorie requirements in extreme cold were enormous. Men who pulled heavy sleds every day burned thousands of calories. Fat became the most valuable source of energy. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat and fat, formed the basis of many rations. In addition, there were rusks, sugar, tea, and chocolate. Each portion has been accurately calculated. Too little food meant exhaustion. Too much increased weight. Scurvy was a constant threat. Previous expeditions had painfully learned how vitamin deficiency led to weakness and death. Fresh meat was the most effective prevention. Amundsen's strategy of deliberately slaughtering dogs secured not only food, but also vitamins. Scott's expedition also had fresh meat from seals and penguins at base camp, but on the long march inland, supplies were more difficult. In addition to food, fuel played a decisive role. Paraffin was needed for stoves to melt snow and prepare meals. Without liquid water, survival was impossible. Every can had to be sealed, every consumption calculated. Evaporation or leaks could have dramatic consequences. The loss of a few liters of fuel could prevent the melting of drinking water, and thus mean the end. Psychological preparation was also part of the planning. Months in isolation, monotonous landscape, extreme stress, all of this required mental strength. Amundsen chose men from similar backgrounds, experienced in skiing, familiar with cold. Homogeneity should minimize conflicts. Scott, on the other hand, led a more diverse team, with scientists and officers of different temperaments. For him, comradeship was a moral value, not just a functional necessity. The differences in preparation reflected two worldviews. For Amundsen, the South Pole was a logistical problem that could be solved with clear planning. For Scott, he was part of a larger moral and scientific enterprise. Both approaches had strengths and risks. When the depots were laid out and the Antarctic winter hit the base camps, there was time to think. Darkness, temperatures well below freezing, months of isolation. In these weeks, it was decided whether planning and reality matched. Equipment was checked, dogs were trained, ponies were cared for. Every weak point had to be recognized before the actual march began. Nature remained unimpressed by human calculations. Snowstorms swept over the Ross ice shelf. Temperatures dropped below -50 degrees. But it was precisely these conditions that served as a test field. Anyone who discovered errors here could correct them. Anyone who overlooked them risked everything later. Preparations for life and death. This expression was no exaggeration. In Antarctica, there was no rescue, no quick help. Decisions had to be made months in advance. An incorrectly calculated depot, an animal that is too weak, a leaking fuel can, all of this could become fatal weeks later. When the spring of 1911 finally dawned and the sun rose higher again, the plans were complete. Dogs were ready, ponies saddled, sleds loaded. Men checked their equipment one last time. Months of preparation lay behind them. Ahead of them lay a distance of over 1,000 kilometers, there and back. At that moment, it was still unclear which strategy would prove to be superior. Antarctica had accepted both teams, but they had not yet decided. Dogs against ponies. Efficiency versus tradition. Calculation against idealism. The real race was about to begin, but its outcome was already laid out in these preparations, in every decision that had been made in warm rooms far from the pole. Chapter 8. Heading for Antarctica, the journey with the Fram and the Terra Nova. Even before the first sled glided over the ice sheet, the race on the open sea began. The trip to Antarctica was not just a prelude, but a crucial part of the undertaking. Weeks and months at sea separated Europe from the southernmost continent of the Earth. Between turbulent oceans, drifting icebergs, and the steadily falling temperature, an ambitious plan became reality. Two ships set course for the end of the world, the Fram under the command of Roald Amundsen and the Terra Nova under the command of Robert Falcon Scott. The Fram was no ordinary ship. It had been specially designed for polar expeditions, with a massive round-shaped hull that did not resist the pressure of the pack ice, but avoided it. Instead of being crushed, it should be lifted off the ice. It had already proven its extraordinary stability under Fridtjof Nansen. For Amundsen, it was not just a means of transport, but a strategic resource, proven, reliable, calculable. The Terra Nova, on the other hand, was originally a whaling ship. Robust, seaworthy, but not specially designed for months of ice drift. Nevertheless, it was considered suitable for the journey through Antarctic waters. Scott's expedition was larger, heavier equipped, scientifically more extensive. The ship carried not only supplies for the pole advance, but also equipment for extensive research programs. Both expeditions started in 1910, but under different circumstances. Amundsen left Norway rather reservedly, almost discreetly. It was only on the way that he finally informed his crew that the destination was not the Arctic, but Antarctica. This revelation was a moment of tension, but the men accepted the decision. They trusted their manager, and knew that they were part of a historic company. Scott, on the other hand, set off under great public attention. Farewells were accompanied by patriotic speeches. Newspaper reports documented every detail. The Empire looked at the Terra Nova as if it carried not only an expedition, but national hopes. As soon as we set sail, it was clear that this trip would be in the spotlight. The route initially led both ships through familiar waters. But the further south they got, the rougher the sea became. The South Atlantic and later the South Pacific were notorious for severe storms. Huge waves crashed against the hulls. Spray froze on deck. Men fought against seasickness, against wetness, against the monotonous confinement of life on board. For the animals on board, the crossing was particularly stressful. Amundsen's dogs had to be exercised, fed, and calmed down regularly. Her condition would be decisive later. Scott's ponies also suffered from the conditions. The swaying decks, the salty air, the restricted movement, all of this drained their strength even before they set foot on Antarctic soil. The journey was not only physically demanding, but also psychological. For weeks you saw nothing but water and sky. Conversations revolved around plans, routes, possible dangers. Maps were studied, diaries kept, equipment checked. Everyone knew that with every degree of latitude, the return became more difficult. A particularly dangerous section was the so-called Roaring Forties and Furious 50s, those latitudes in which strong westerly winds blow unchecked around the globe. Here the seaworthiness of the ships became apparent. The Fram once again proved its stability. The Terra Nova was caught in severe storms at times, lost equipment, and fought against water penetration. Already at sea it became clear that nature made no distinctions between nations. When the first icebergs appeared on the horizon, the mood on board changed. They were majestic and menacing at the same time, floating cathedrals made of ice, the mass of which was only visible to a fraction. Navigating between them required the utmost attention. A collision would have catastrophic consequences. With the arrival of the pack ice, a new phase began. The open sea turned into a labyrinth of drifting floes. The ship had to maneuver carefully, always looking for open water areas. Sounds of breaking ice echoed through the hulls. The temperature continued to fall. Breath froze in the air. For Amundsen, this section was familiar. His Arctic experience helped him to assess risks. He knew when patience was required and when decisive action was necessary. Scott's team, on the other hand, had less practical routine in the dense pack ice. The Terra Nova was temporarily encircled and had to fight its way free. Despite all the dangers, arriving in Antarctic waters was a moment of awe. Endless expanses of ice, a light that had a different effect than in Europe, a silence that was only interrupted by the cracking of the ice. This is where the real adventure began. Amundsen headed for the Bay of Whales at the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf. The choice of this location was strategic. Closer to the South Pole, shorter distance, potential advantage in the race. The landing was tricky. The ice shelf was able to break off. Crevasses were invisible. But the Fram reached its destination, and the men began to unload. Scott chose Cape Evans on the Ross Sea, a proven location for previous expeditions. Here there were relatively stable conditions for a base camp. Unloading the Terra Nova was also a logistical challenge. Tons of equipment, animals, fuel, scientific equipment, everything had to be brought safely ashore before the ship left again. With the unloading, a new phase of isolation began. The ships would soon return or withdraw from the ice. What remained were men, supplies, and the endless expanse of the continent. The connection to home was broken. From now on, they were on their own. The sea voyage had done more than just transport. It had welded the teams together, exposed weaknesses, caused the first losses. It had shown how differently the two expeditions were organized, one focused and homogeneous, the other multi-layered and ambitious. When the Fram and the Terra Nova finally left their anchorages or withdrew from the immediate mission, the race had finally arrived in Antarctica. The oceans were behind them, but the biggest challenge was yet to come. The journey across the sea was a transition, from civilization to isolation, from planning to execution. It was the gateway to the last white continent. And while the waves crashed against the hulls and icebergs passed silently, everyone on board knew that the real battle would not be decided at sea, but on the endless plateau of ice. But without this journey, there would have been no race. The Fram and the Terra Nova were more than ships. They were the bridges between two worlds, between hope and reality, between nations and the merciless South. Chapter 9. Base Camp in the Eternal Ice, Framheim and Cape Evans. When the ships had disappeared and the cracking of the ice became the loudest constant again, a phase began for both expeditions that is often underestimated: life in base camp. No step had yet been taken towards the South Pole, but here, between snow walls and wooden barracks, the foundations for success or failure were laid. In the white seclusion, two small worlds were created: Framheim under the direction of Roald Amundsen and Cape Evans under the command of Robert Falcon Scott. Framheim was located in the Bay of Whales at the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf. The location was strategically chosen, closer to the South Pole than previous British camps, on stable ice shelves that looked like a huge floating platform. But it was precisely this proximity that also brought uncertainty. The ice shelf was not a solid rock, but an ice field several hundred meters thick that slowly drifted towards the sea. Cracks could form, and there was a risk of break-offs. Amundsen was aware of this risk, and accepted it in favor of the shorter distance to the pole. The camp itself was functional, almost Spartan. A prefabricated wooden house formed the center. It has been partially buried in the snow to provide protection from the wind and gain additional insulation. Walls were reinforced with blocks of snow, supplies were carefully stacked, workshops were set up. Order was not an aesthetic luxury, but a survival strategy. Every object had its place. The dogs, the heart of Amundsen's plan, were given their own areas. They had to be fed, cared for, and trained. Their condition would determine speed and range. Daily routines gave the camp structure. Repairs to sleds, adjustments to clothing, test runs on skis, nothing was left to chance. The Antarctic winter was not seen as a break, but as a time for preparation. Cape Evans, the British base camp on the Ross Sea, had a completely different effect. The location was proven, already used by previous expeditions. Here the terrain was firmer, rockier, less dependent on drifting ice. Scott's crew built a larger hut, more spacious, with separate areas for scientific work. Tables, shelves, instruments. The warehouse almost had the character of a research station. The atmosphere in Cape Evans was more diverse. In addition to officers and sailors, there were geologists, biologists, and meteorologists. Samples were collected, experiments were carried out, measurement data recorded. While temperatures of -40 degrees prevailed outside, Men discussed rock layers and weather patterns by lamplight. Antarctica was not only an opponent here, but an object of research. But discipline was also crucial in Cape Evans. Depots had to be created, animals had to be cared for, snowmobiles had to be maintained. The ponies were in sheltered shelters, but the climate took its toll on them. Food was precious, every bite had to be calculated. The dogs were also trained, although less systematically than Amundsen's. Scott relied on a combination of different means of transport. The preparation was correspondingly complex. The Antarctic winter descended on both camps like an invisible bell. For weeks, the sun disappeared completely behind the horizon. Darkness became part of everyday life. Only the flickering light of kerosene lamps illuminated the interiors. Outside, the wind howled, shook walls, piled up snow into meter-high drifts. Isolation had different effects on the men. In Framheim, the group was small, homogeneous, focused on one goal. Meals together, card games, conversations. Everyday life was simple but clearly structured. Amundsen made sure that tensions were detected early. Conflicts could escalate in this environment. Harmony was part of the strategy. In Cape Evans, the social fabric was more complex. Different temperaments clashed. Academics lived alongside naval officers. Discussions were lively, sometimes controversial. Scott led with a mixture of authority and care. His diaries show a man who not only plans, but also observes the mood of his team, the health of individuals, the dynamics in the team. The winter also offered the opportunity to explore the surroundings. Short excursions at dusk tested equipment and orientation. Men learned how snow behaved at different temperatures, how wind obliterated tracks, how easy it was to lose direction. Every experience flowed into the planning of the big march. Psychologically, this time was decisive. Months in darkness, without contact with the outside world, demanded mental strength. Homesickness, doubts, latent fears. All of this was present, even if it was rarely talked about openly. In Framheim, the clear goal orientation helped. In Cape Evans, the scientific occupation. Work was distraction and meaning at the same time. The winter was also a physical challenge. Despite thick clothing, the cold crept into every joint. Breath condensed into ice on ceilings and walls. Moisture could freeze clothes stiffly. Any mistake in drying boots or gloves took revenge the next day. Hygiene was difficult, but necessary. Diseases could have a devastating effect in isolation. The preparation of the depots was one of the most important tasks. Both expeditions used the late winter and early spring to place supplies along the planned route. These advances were already dangerous. Storms could force teams to turn around. Crevasses in the ice were invisible traps. But without depots, an advance to the pole was impossible. Amundsen generously marked his depots with rows of flags that were visible from afar. He didn't want to take the risk of missing them on the way back. Scott also created portfolios, but the markings were less widely spread. Small differences in planning, which were later to become very important. When the sun finally returned and the days became longer, the mood in both camps changed. Light brought energy, but also restlessness. The moment of departure was approaching. Months of preparation would soon be put to the test. Framheim looked ready, compact, efficient, focused. Cape Evans was just as prepared, but more complex, with multiple destinations and greater logistical diversity. Both camps were masterpieces of human adaptation to an extreme environment. And yet they were only intermediate stations. Two small communities had wintered in the eternal ice, separated by hundreds of kilometers, connected by the same dream. The huts, half sunk in the snow, stood like silent witnesses of human ambition. Soon they would be left empty while their inhabitants made their way to the heart of the continent. Here in Framheim and Cape Evans, it was decided how well planning and reality fit together. This showed how leadership, discipline, and camaraderie worked under pressure. There was still no race visible, only preparation. Doch das Eis Wartet. Und dem ersten langen Tag du Antarktischen Frühlings begann die letzte Phase der Still, Beverbeugung alles verandert. Chapter 10. The long march begins. First stages across the ice shelf. With the first stable light of the Antarctic spring, the time of waiting ended. Months of preparation, planning, and training culminated in a moment that seemed quiet and unspectacular, and yet changed everything. Sleds were tensioned, belts tightened, final touches checked. Then the men started moving. The long march had begun. For Roald Amundsen, the final departure fell on October 19, 1911. 5 men, 52 dogs, several sleds, a compact, well-rehearsed team left Framheim and drove out onto the Ross ice shelf. The temperature was low, but the sun was above the horizon again. The light was glaring, reflected off the snow with an intensity that hurt the eyes. Snow goggles were not a luxury, but a necessity. The ice shelf was a seemingly endless plain. No mountain, no tree, no visible landmark. Only white in all directions. But beneath this calm surface, dangers lurked. Crevasses could suddenly open. Thin snow bridges could break over hidden abysses. Every step had to be taken consciously. The dogs ran in a practiced rhythm, sleds glided on skis, men moved efficiently, almost silently. Amundsen's pace was high. Skis enabled smooth gliding movements. Dogs took over most of the load. Breaks were kept short, rations were precisely measured. The rhythm of the day was clearly structured, several marching stages, short stops, pitching the tents in the evening, melting the snow, eating, writing a diary, sleeping. Routine was protection against chaos. At the same time, Robert Falcon Scott was also preparing for the big push. On November 1, 1911, his team set off from Cape Evans. The initial situation was more complex: snowmobiles, ponies, dogs, several support groups. The march began with mixed optimism. The machines were to take on heavy loads, the ponies to cover a large part of the route. But the ice shelf quickly showed its hardness. The snowmobiles dropped out early. Mechanical problems, cold, uneven ground, the hoped for technical superiority dissolved into disappointment. The ponies fought their way through deep snow, sank in, exhausted themselves quickly. Her breath froze in the air, her movements became sluggish. Already in the first few days it became clear that the burden was enormous. The ice shelf itself seemed monotonous, but it was anything but harmless. Snowdrifts made it difficult to make progress. Wind could suddenly freshen up and reduce visibility to a few meters. Orientation was provided with the help of compasses and the sun, but even these could be deceiving when fog came up or snowstorms swallowed up the landscape. For Amundsen's team, the first stages went according to plan. The dogs pulled reliably, the sleds ran well. Depots that had been created in winter were checked. Every depot found was a moment of confirmation. Planning had worked. The men seemed concentrated, almost relaxed. The march was not a heroic act, but a logistical implementation. For Scott, on the other hand, the pace slowed down increasingly. The ponies proved to be susceptible to the conditions. One after the other had to be shot as soon as he was too weak to move on. These moments were emotionally stressful. Animals that had been cared for months were now sacrificed. At the same time, the burden on the men increased. More and more weight had to be moved by human power. The vastness of the ice shelf had a psychological dimension. Days passed without the picture on the horizon changing. No progress was visible, only the kilometers on the map grew. Monotony could wear you down. Conversations became shorter, thoughts revolved around distances, around supplies, around the invisible goal. Amundsen used this phase to further implement his strategy. Dogs were reduced as needed, meat carefully distributed. Every decision was embedded in a long-term plan. Speed remained the top priority. The faster they crossed the ice shelf, the greater their lead, even if they didn't know exactly where Scott was. In Scott's case, the character of the march gradually shifted. Support groups accompanied the main team, but gradually turned back. This staggered strategy was intended to save resources, but increased the organizational effort. Every farewell was a small incision. The group became smaller, the burden of responsibility greater. The weather played a decisive role. On good days, the sun was shining, the snow reflected dazzlingly, the wind was moderate. On bad days, gusts whipped across the plain, snow crystals cut into the face like needles. Tents had to be secured with all their might. Standing still meant a loss of time, but continuing in a storm could be dangerous. The temperatures remained extremely low. When breathing, moisture froze in beards and eyelashes. Gloves had to be changed regularly to avoid frostbite. Even small carelessness could have serious consequences. An unprotected finger, a soaked boot, and the cold took hold mercilessly. The further south both teams advanced, the more clearly a new challenge loomed on the horizon, the Transantarctic Mountains. But the seemingly flat but deceptive world of the ice shelf still lay ahead of them. For Amundsen, this phase was a test of his planning. For Scott, it was already a first test of endurance that exposed weaknesses. The race was still invisible, no flag, no direct comparison. And yet it was here that it was decided how much strength and morale would be left for the coming stages. The ice shelf was not a spectacular opponent. It offered no dramatic cliffs, no visible obstacles. Its danger lay in uniformity, in quiet exhaustion, in the gradual consumption of energy. It was the staying power that counted here. Day after day, sleds and skis left narrow tracks in the snow, which were soon blown away by the wind. Nothing remained except the entries in diaries and the growing numbers on the map. The South Pole was still far away, but the path there was now irreversibly taken. The long march had begun. And while the ice crunched under the blades and dogs pulled evenly, it was clear, from now on, every decision, every delay, every exhaustion would have immediate consequences. The ice shelf was only the first stage, but it was the stage on which it became clear whose preparation could withstand reality. Chapter 11. Setbacks and Decisions, Weather, Losses, and Doubts. With every kilometer that took them further south, it became clearer that the race to the South Pole was not a linear march, but a succession of trials. Planning could absorb a lot, discipline could compensate for a lot, but Antarctica remained unpredictable. Weather changes, material fatigue, physical weakness, and inner doubts mixed into an invisible but constant burden. In this phase, it was not only speed and logistics that were decisive, but character. For Roald Amundsen, the advance initially went according to plan. But his expedition was not free of setbacks either. As early as September 1911, he had dared to set out for the first time, too early. Temperatures of below -50 degrees forced the team to turn back. Some men suffered frostbite, tensions arose. Amundsen had to realize that even his meticulous schedule was subordinate to reality. The decision to return was not a sign of weakness, but of adaptability. Nevertheless, she left her mark on the team's trust. When the final march began in October, caution was part of every stage. But the ice shelf and later the ascent over the previously unknown Axel Heiberg Glacier posed new challenges. Crevasses crisscrossed the ice, partly openly visible, partly hidden only by thin snow covers. Dogs broke in several times, sleds tipped over, men had to secure themselves with ropes. Each incident was a reminder of how quickly routine could turn into danger. Weather played a double role in this. It was opponent and pace setter at the same time. Days with clear skies allowed long marching stages, but sudden storms forced the team to stay in the tent. Snowdrifts buried tracks and made orientation difficult. The loss of a securities account would have had catastrophic consequences. Amundsen's generous markings paid off, but the constant uncertainty remained. The planned reduction in the number of dogs was also emotionally stressful. Animals that had been trained for months were now slaughtered to secure food and save weight. For Amundsen, this was a calculated necessity. For some of his men, it was a moral turning point. Decisions that seemed logical in theory became more severe in practice. Meanwhile, Robert Falcon Scott struggled with a growing chain of problems. The snowmobiles had broken down early. The ponies, not ideal for deep snow anyway, quickly showed exhaustion. One after the other had to be killed. With each loss, not only the transport capacity decreased, but also morale. What had started as a multifaceted strategy increasingly turned into a burden. The weather exacerbated the situation. Snowstorms slowed the advance. Extreme cold affected humans and animals alike. Scott's team was forced to take a break more often than planned. Each delay meant higher consumption of supplies, and thus less room for maneuver on the way back. A particularly delicate moment arose when Scott decided to expand the final pole team from the original 4 to 5 men. Henry Robertson Bowers was accepted into the group. This decision was an expression of loyalty and trust, but it had logistical consequences. Rations and tent capacities had been calculated for 4. Now they had to improvise. In the isolation of the high plateau, a small deviation could have a big effect. The climb over the Beardmore Glacier was a huge strain for Scott's team. Crevasses, steep climbs, thin air, every step required strength. Unlike Amundsen's route, this path had already been explored, but that hardly lessened the physical effort. The men pulled their sleds themselves, often against strong headwinds. Exhaustion became a constant companion. With increasing altitude and falling temperatures, doubts crept in. Was the pace sufficient? Would the supplies be enough? Was Amundsen perhaps already ahead? The uncertainty was grueling. In a world without radio communication, all speculation remained unanswered. Amundsen also felt the pressure. Although his team was moving faster, he didn't know how close Scott was. The unknown route over the Axel Heiberg Glacier posed risks. Several times they had to find new paths through rugged terrain. Every detour cost time and energy, but the discipline of the team held. Skis enabled efficient locomotion. Dogs pulled constantly. The biggest challenge in this phase was not only physical, but mental. Monotony alternated with danger, routine with sudden crisis. Men who had previously spent the winter in orderly camps were now exposed to the elements day after day. Sleep was often restless, fingers and toes numb from the cold. Small injuries healed poorly. Every decision had to be made under tiredness. Scott began to strike an increasingly thoughtful tone in his diary. He reflected on responsibility, on the expectations of his nation, on the burden on his comrades. Doubts did not mean giving up, but they showed how much the expedition was draining on substance. At the same time, he stuck to his goal. Turning back, as long as there was still hope, was not an option for him. Amundsen, on the other hand, concentrated on numbers, remaining kilometers, food rations, number of dogs. His strategy was based on precision, but he also had to remain flexible. Weather breaks extended the journey. Unexpected crevasses slowed down the pace. Each additional day increased consumption. A central element of this phase was trust in one's own planning and in one's comrades. Conflicts could be deadly. Both leaders knew that unity was essential for survival. Open discussions were limited. Decisions had to be accepted. When both teams finally reached the Antarctic plateau, the South Pole was within reach, and yet still hundreds of kilometers away. The landscape hardly changed. White ice, blue sky, cutting wind. Progress was measurable, but not visible. Setbacks had already left their mark. In Scott's case, resources had shrunk, animals had been lost, speed had dropped. At Amundsen, the team had become smaller, dogs reduced, but the plan held. Both teams had tested the weather, losses, and doubts in different ways. In this phase, it became clear that the race would not be decided by courage alone. Decisions, often seemingly small, determined the course. A day off or an extra march, a slaughtered dog or a spared one, an added team member or not, all of this shaped the result. The South Pole was now more than a geographical destination. He was the point at which every decision would add up. But it was still hidden invisibly on the horizon. Between storm and silence, between hope and exhaustion, two groups moved further into the heart of Antarctica. Setbacks hadn't stopped them, but they had shown how thin the line was on which they walked. Chapter 12. The Way Over the Transantarctic Mountains. New Routes into the Unknown. At some point, every seemingly endless level ends. On the horizon, at first barely recognizable in the shimmering light, a darker line rose against the white of the sky. The Transantarctic Mountains, a huge barrier of ice and rock several thousand kilometers long, separated the Ross ice shelf from the Antarctic plateau. Anyone who wanted to reach the South Pole had to overcome this natural wall. Here it was decided whether planning, courage, and strength were enough to break new ground. For Roald Amundsen, this section was the riskiest part of his entire route. Unlike Robert Falcon Scott, who used the already well-known Beardmore Glacier, Amundsen chose a previously unexplored approach, the later so-called Axel Heiberg Glacier. The decision was strategically motivated. The new path promised a shorter distance to the high plateau, and thus a time advantage. But it was a leap into the unknown. When Amundsen's team reached the mountains, the landscape changed dramatically. The flat monotony of the ice shelf gave way to jagged icefalls, steep climbs, and deep crevasses. Snow bridges spanned invisible abysses. Dogs had to be led carefully. Sleds had to be secured with ropes. Every meter became a technical challenge. The ascent required precise coordination. The men worked in short, intensive stages. Sleds were pulled up in sections, partly unloaded to reduce weight. Skis still offered advantages, but they had to be taken off on steep passages. The terrain forced improvisation. This is exactly where it became clear how well prepared a team was for unexpected situations. For Amundsen, this was the moment when his philosophy was put to the test. Efficiency did not mean rigid adherence to a plan, but flexible adaptation. He changed the route within the glacier system several times, looking for flatter ramps to avoid steep ice walls. Time was lost, but safety took priority. A fall, a lost sled, an injured man, that would have endangered the entire company. The dogs continued to play a central role, but the ascent cost her an enormous amount of energy. Some animals fell into crevices and had to be rescued or abandoned. Each such scene was a moment of tense silence. Ropes stretched, men held their breath while the depths yawned beneath them. Antarctica now showed its rugged face. Meanwhile, Scott's expedition was also approaching the Transantarctic Mountains, but on more familiar terrain. The Beardmore Glacier had already been explored by Ernest Shackleton. Maps existed, rough empirical values were available. But familiarity did not mean ease. The glacier was huge, rugged, crisscrossed by crevasse fields and icefalls. For Scott and his men, the climb was a physical ordeal. The snowmobiles had long since broken down, the ponies sacrificed. Most of the burden now rested on human shoulders. Sleds were pulled in the so-called man-hauling, a method that required enormous strength. Every step uphill cost energy, which was consumed even faster in the thinning air. The mountains looked monumental. Black rock faces rose from the ice, wind swept unchecked through valleys, snow plumes danced on peaks. The silence was piercing, interrupted only by the crunch of runners and the rhythmic breathing of exhausted men. The Transantarctic Mountains were not a passive transition, but a test of endurance and determination. For Scott, the strain increased in this phase. Exhaustion was noticeable, minor injuries worsened, but the men stuck together. Comradeship was their strongest resource. Everyone knew that a slackening could endanger the entire group. Support groups gradually turned around until only the core team moved on. On the Axel Heiberg Glacier, on the other hand, Amundsen's team was smaller, more homogeneous. The communication was concise and targeted. Decisions were made quickly. When they finally reached the high plateau, It was a moment of quiet relief. The most difficult topographical section was behind them. In front of them stretched a new, seemingly flat world, but at an altitude of over 3,000 meters, with even colder temperatures. Scott's team also finally reached the high plateau. But the price was high. The men were already severely weakened. The altitude was noticeable. Breathing became shallower, exhaustion deeper. The path over the mountains had used up energy reserves, which would be decisive for the way back. The high plateau seemed paradoxical. After the dramatic ice breaks, it seemed almost calm. No steep climbs, no visible abysses. And yet it was more hostile to life than anything before. Temperatures continued to drop. Wind swept unhindered over the wide area. Orientation remained difficult. Without prominent points, it was easy to lose the sense of direction and distance. For Amundsen, reaching the plateau meant confirmation. The risky choice of a new route had worked. His team was intact. The dogs were still efficient, the supplies sufficient. Speed remained high. The South Pole was approaching. For Scott, on the other hand, the high plateau was a period of quiet tension. The thought that Amundsen might have been ahead could not be suppressed. But there was no certainty. Only one's own marching performance counted. Every kilometer was a step closer to a goal that was now more than a geographical coordinate. It was a test of one's own will. The path over the Transantarctic Mountains marked the transition from the known to the truly unknown. For Amundsen, it was new territory in the literal sense. For Scott, it was a familiar but no less dangerous path. Both had overcome the barrier, but in different conditions. The mountains had shown how different their strategies were. One relied on dogs, skis, and minimal friction losses. The other relied on human pull, discipline, and moral fortitude. Both paths led upwards. But the question remained as to which one would leave enough reserves for the way back. When the last foothills of the mountains disappeared behind them and the high plateau spread out in front of them, it was clear the most difficult topographical section was behind them. But the race was not yet decided. The last, long stretch lay ahead of them, flat, cold, merciless. New routes into the unknown had led them here. Now it would become clear whether they were strong enough to reach the heart of Antarctica and return alive. Chapter 13. December 14th, 1911, Amundsen reaches the South Pole. The high plateau lay still under a sky that looked like frozen glass. No sound except the steady gliding of the runners, the muffled panting of the dogs, and the rhythmic crunch of skis in the snow. For weeks, Roald Amundsen and his small team had been moving across this endless plain. Every day was a repetition of departure, march, break, tent pitching, cooking, sleep, and yet every day was a step closer to a point that no one had ever entered before. The temperatures were well below -30 degrees, often even lower. The wind was not always strong, but even a slight breeze could cut like a knife at this altitude. The high plateau was over 3,000 meters above sea level. The air was thin, every breath cost more strength than at sea level. But compared to the jagged glaciers behind them, this landscape seemed almost merciful. No steep ice walls, no open crevasse fields, only vastness. Amundsen did not move like a man in search of a myth, but like someone who worked through a calculated route. The navigation was precise. Sextant measurements, position of the sun, compass positions were regularly determined and deviations corrected. The South Pole was not a visible target. It was a mathematical point defined by 90 degrees south latitude. You couldn't see it, only calculate. The days before December 14th were characterized by tense concentration. Everyone knew they were approaching. The numbers on the map shrank. 89 degrees south. 89 degrees 30 minutes. 89 degrees 45 minutes. The circle tightened. Conversations became shorter, the eyes more often directed to the horizon, although nothing looked different there than before. Amundsen led 4 men with him, experienced skiers, disciplined, well-rehearsed. The dogs, now significantly fewer than when they left, still pulled reliably. The plan to reduce animals on the road had worked. The sleds had become lighter, the rations were sufficient. Despite all the toughness, the team was in remarkably stable condition. On the morning of December 14, 1911, the weather was clear. The light was glaring, the snow reflected it with dazzling intensity. The men left early. There was still no visible sign, no monument, no natural marking. Only the certainty that they were moving in an invisible circle, the center of which was their goal. Around noon, Amundsen took measurements again. Sextant and artificial horizon were built, calculations were made, results were checked. The men waited in silence while their leader compared the numbers. Finally, he looked up, looked around, and nodded. They had arrived. No dramatic moment, no cry of jubilation that echoed over mountains. Only 5 men in an endless white world, knowing that they had reached a point that no one had yet entered. The South Pole, abstract, invisible, and yet of enormous symbolic significance. Amundsen acted methodically. He wanted to be sure. Several measurements were carried out, at different times of the day, in order to minimize possible errors. They moved within a small radius to make sure they didn't miss the exact geographical point. Precision was part of his self-image. A symbolic victory without exact confirmation would have been incomplete. When the calculations agreed, the Norwegian flag was hoisted. Red, white, and blue in the glaring light of Antarctica. A piece of cloth in the wind, and yet a sign that would go around the world. Amundsen named the place Framheim, home at the pole. A tent was erected, carefully fastened, and provided with another flag. In this tent, Amundsen placed a letter, addressed to Robert Falcon Scott, in case Scott should arrive after him. The letter asked that it be forwarded to King Haakon VII of Norway in the event of an accident. It was a sober gesture, both sporting and strategic. Amundsen knew that Scott might not be far behind him. The race was decided, but he respected the competitor. The men photographed each other, capturing the moment. No exaggerated celebration, no lingering long. The temperatures were too low, the conditions too harsh to stay long. The South Pole was the destination, not the end point. The way back was still completely ahead of them. And yet in these hours a quiet meaning was palpable. Norway, which had become fully independent only a few years earlier, had achieved the greatest geographical goal of its time. A small country had beaten an empire, not by size, but by strategy, experience, and precision. Amundsen himself noted the success in his diary matter-of-factly, almost soberly. No pathetic tone, no self-aggrandizement. He had defined a goal, developed a plan, and implemented it. The South Pole was not an emotional triumph, but the result of consistent preparation. Nevertheless, the moment was historic. For the first time, a human being stood at the southernmost point of the Earth. From here, every step led only to the north. There was no further south. Geography itself had reached a limit. The men spent only a short time at the pole. Measurements were repeated, the tent secured, markings set. Amundsen wanted to leave no doubt that they had actually been there. Precision and documentation should end any subsequent discussion. Then they began preparations for the return march. True success lay not only in reaching the pole, but in returning safely. Amundsen knew that many expeditions on the way back had failed. Euphoria was not allowed to turn into negligence. The wind remained cold, the distance remained great, the danger remained real. As they moved away from the pole, only the small tent with the flag remained behind them, a tiny contrast to the endless expanse. The snow would soon cover their tracks. But in Europe, as soon as the news arrived, it would make waves. On December 14, 1911, the race was decided, at least on paper. Amundsen had won. But no one outside the ice knew about it yet. No newspaper reported, no nation rejoiced. Initially, the triumph only existed in 5 minds and in a few photographs. As they retreated north, Amundsen knew that somewhere behind them was Scott's team. Maybe only days, maybe weeks away. The thought of the competitor remained present, not as a threat, but as a reality. The South Pole itself remained untouched by human significance. It was the same point as the day before, but everything had changed for history. In the quiet cold of the high plateau, a calculating strategist had achieved his goal. Not by luck, not by heroic improvisation, but by planning, adaptation, and discipline. December 14th, 1911 became a date that would remain anchored in atlases and history books. But while the Norwegian flag fluttered in the Antarctic wind, the story didn't end there. For the way back, and the fate of those who would arrive later, was to give the race a tragedy that went beyond mere victory. Chapter 14. January 17th, 1912, Scott's bitter discovery. The high plateau lay motionless under a sky that seemed bleached. For days, Robert Falcon Scott and his 4 companions had been moving across the seemingly endless expanse. The wind was sharp, the temperatures were far below freezing, and yet it was not just the cold that was eating away at them. It was the uncertainty. After the arduous ascent over the Beardmore Glacier, Scott, Edward Wilson, Henry Robertson Bowers, Lawrence Oates, and Edgar Evans had reached the Antarctic Plateau. The most difficult topographical section was behind them, but the physical reserves were already affected. The sleds were now pulled exclusively by human power. Each day's stage was a fight against exhaustion. The rations were strictly calculated. Fat, rusks, tea, there was nothing more. Every bite was measured, every pause short. The altitude of over 3,000 meters made it difficult to breathe. The body demanded more energy than food could provide. And again the question that no one said out loud: were they the first? In the days leading up to January 17th, there was an almost intangible tension in the air. Scott noted hopes and doubts at the same time in his diary. They were close, they knew that. The width measurements confirmed it. 89 degrees south. 89 degrees 30 minutes. Only a few days' march separated them from the goal they had had in mind for years. On January 16th, they noticed something on the horizon. A dark spot, barely perceptible in the shimmering light. At first, it seemed to be an optical illusion, a play of shadows and snowdrifts. But the closer they got, the clearer a shape emerged. A towering line against the white. The next day, January 17th, 1912, the hunch turned into certainty. A black tent stood on the plateau. A flag flew next to it. It was the Norwegian flag. At that moment, the burden of uncertainty fell from them, and was replaced by another, the certainty of defeat. Roald Amundsen had been here before them. Weeks earlier. The race was decided. Scott later described the moment with sober clarity. "The worst has happened," he wrote. No dramatic exclamations, no accusation. Only the simple statement that they had arrived too late. The men reached the tent, which Amundsen had called Polheim. Inside, they found a message, carefully deposited, a letter to Scott, asking him to forward it in case of an accident. The gesture was matter-of-fact, almost polite. But it made reality unmistakable. They had reached their goal, but not the first. The British flag was still hoisted. A photo was taken. 5 men stood next to each other, tired, bearded, marked by cold and exertion. Their faces betrayed no euphoria. The triumph they had imagined had given way to a quiet bitterness. And yet, at that moment, there was another form of greatness. They had come this far, despite unusual snowmobiles, despite lost ponies, despite physical weakness. They had reached the heart of Antarctica. But the glory of the first was lost. The symbolic significance was enormous. For Scott, it meant not only a personal defeat, but a national one. The Empire, which had invested so much in this expedition, would not emerge victorious. The thought weighed heavily. But there was no time for long reflection. The South Pole was not a place to linger. The temperatures were extreme, the wind unpredictable. The real battle was still ahead of them, the way back over more than 1,300 kilometers. On the same day, they began preparations for the march north. There was no plan B, no alternative. Only the route back over the high plateau and the Beardmore Glacier, past the depots that represented their only hope. But something had changed. The psychological drive to arrive first had disappeared. What remained was a sense of duty, and the will to at least return home alive. The following days were marked by increasing exhaustion. The disappointment gnawed at the background, but it was above all the physical weakness that made itself felt. Edgar Evans, already weakened by previous injuries, showed clear signs of decay. Falls, frostbite, confusion. The extreme strain had its price. Lawrence Oates also suffered severely from frostbite on his feet. Every step became torture. And yet he moved on, silently, disciplined. Scott kept a diary, even under the most adverse conditions. His entries show no bitter resentment against Amundsen. Instead, concern for the team and sober analysis dominate. He knew that her situation was serious. The rations were scarce, the weather deteriorated. Storms forced them to stop again and again. Tents were shaken by gusts. Snowdrifts buried equipment. Every day lost meant higher consumption, fewer reserves. The South Pole, which they had reached on January 17th, lagged behind them, a symbolic point in a landscape that showed no signs of human drama. The ice remained indifferent. What had started as a race now turned into a fight for survival. The bitter discovery at the pole was not only the end of a race. It was the beginning of a tragedy that slowly unfolded. The psychological burden, combined with physical exhaustion and harsh weather conditions, formed a dangerous mixture. And yet, there is no resignation in Scott's notes. He spoke of duty, of perseverance, of hope for better conditions. Even in defeat, he held on to dignity. January 17th, 1912 was a turning point. On this day, idealism met reality. Ambition met the sober logic of the time. Amundsen had won, not by chance, but by strategy. Scott had lost, not for lack of courage, but for efficiency and perhaps luck. When the 5 men left the pole, the flag of Great Britain had been hoisted, the photo taken, the coordinates noted. The historic moment was captured. But it did not bring jubilation, but a quiet, heavy realization. The race was over. What followed would no longer be determined by the pursuit of fame, but by the naked will to survive. Chapter 15. Tragedy, Legacy and Myth. What remains of the race? When Robert Falcon Scott and his 4 companions left the South Pole on January 17, 1912, the bitter realization of defeat lay behind them, and ahead of them was a way back that would soon prove fatal. The race was decided, but its true significance only became apparent in the weeks that followed. A geographical competition became a story of perseverance, sacrifice, and national memory. The march back began under bad omens. The men were exhausted, supplies were scarce, the weather was unstable. On the high plateau, the conditions worsened. Temperatures continued to fall, storms occurred more frequently. The physical reserves had already been heavily strained during the outward journey. Now the psychological drive of a possible victory was missing. Edgar Evans was the first to collapse. He had already suffered from injuries and weakness on the way there. On February 17, 1912, at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, he died after repeated falls and increasing confusion. His death was a shock and a premonition. The 4 remaining men continued to fight. The descent over the glacier was dangerous, but they reached the Ross ice shelf. There, however, the conditions deteriorated dramatically. Lawrence Oates, whose feet were marked by severe frostbite, could hardly walk. Every stage was delayed. Every delay cost food. On March 16, 1912, Oates left the tent in a snowstorm with the words that he was only going out for a short time and could stay away a little longer. It was a silent act of self-sacrifice. He knew that his weakness slowed down the others. His sacrifice was an expression of the attitude that shaped Scott and his generation: duty over life. But even this step could not turn fate around. Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Robertson Bowers continued to fight, just a few miles from a large supply depot. A persistent storm forced them into their tent. Supplies were running out. Temperatures remained extremely low. They waited for an improvement in the weather, which did not come. At the end of March 1912, the last 3 men died in their tent, only about 11 miles from the rescue depot. Months later, in November 1912, a search party found the camp. The tent was half covered by snow. Scott's diaries were neatly stowed away with him. In them, he documented not only the course of the expedition, but also his thoughts, worries, and hopes. His last entries were marked by concern for the bereaved and the request to take care of them. The news of her death reached Britain at a time when the Empire still believed in its moral and technical superiority. The tragedy hit the public deeply. But it was not told as a failure, but as a heroic sacrifice. Scott was stylized as a martyr, as a man who faced death with dignity and steadfastness. Poems, monuments, school textbooks consolidated the image of the brave officer who gave his life in the service of science and the nation. The loss turned into moral triumph. Defeat in the race took a back seat to greatness in the face of doom. At the same time, Roald Amundsen successfully returned to Norway. His crew had reached the pole on December 14, 1911, and had returned home comparatively safely. His triumph was clear, undisputed. He had planned, calculated, acted efficiently, and won. But the public perception was more complex. In Great Britain, Scott's tragedy overshadowed Amundsen's success. In Norway, on the other hand, the victory was a moment of national self-affirmation. A young country had made history. Over time, historians began to reevaluate both expeditions. Scott's decisions were critically analyzed: the choice of means of transport, the expansion of the pole team, the scarce rations. Amundsen's strategy was hailed as a feat of logistical planning. The contrast between idealistic perseverance and sober efficiency shaped the discussion. But beyond the comparisons, a bigger question remained: what does success mean? Is it just reaching a point on the map? Or the way people deal with defeat? The race to the South Pole became more than a historic event. He became a myth. A myth of ice and ambition, of planning and sacrifice, of national pride and human limitations. In Antarctica itself, hardly a trace remained. Amundsen's tent was carried away by the wind. The tracks of the sledges were blown away. Scott's last camp is still under a thick layer of snow, frozen in the ice. The continent preserves no monuments, only silence. But the story lives on in people's minds. It tells of 2 ways to achieve a goal. One is characterized by strategic precision, the other by moral steadfastness. Both demanded courage. Both demanded everything. The race to the South Pole marked the end of an era, the heroic age of polar exploration. Soon, technical innovations would bring aircraft, radio, and motorized vehicles to Antarctica. The myth of the lonely explorer in the eternal ice would fade. And yet something remains. The story of Amundsen and Scott is a reminder that big goals are more than coordinates. They are touchstones of character, leadership, and preparation. They show how thin the line between triumph and tragedy can be. In the end, there is no easy winner and no clear loser. Amundsen was the first to reach the South Pole, a logistical and historic triumph. Scott failed in the race, but his story became a tale of courage and sacrifice. The South Pole itself continues to stand still, and invisible in the endless white. But the race to get there has burned itself into the collective memory. Tragedy, legacy, and myth, that's what remains of the race.